In 41 AD, Roman senators murdered their emperor in a hallway. They stabbed him 30 times. His wife's skull was smashed against a wall. His infant daughter was thrown against stone until she stopped crying. The emperor's name was Caligula. And here's what nobody tells you. The senators might have been the real monsters. Everything you think you know about Caligula? Almost entirely from his enemies. Imagine if the only record of your life was written by people who murdered you and needed to justify it. But here's where it gets disturbing. When you actually read the ancient sources carefully, not the sensationalized versions, you find something way darker than a mad tyrant. You find a man who was systematically destroyed by the most powerful family in Rome before he even became emperor. And what he did afterwards. That might have been the point. Caligula's real name was Gaius. He got the nickname Caligula, Little Boots, because he grew up in military camps wearing tiny soldier boots. Cute, right? Here's what's not cute. By the time he was 7 years old, he'd watched his father, Rome's greatest general, probably poisoned by the emperor. His mother starved herself to death in prison. His 2 older brothers killed. The emperor doing this was Tiberius, his own great-uncle. And Tiberius kept young Caligula alive, bringing him to the island of Capri. Most historians think it was insurance. Keep one heir alive just in case. But imagine being that teenager. You're living with the man who murdered your entire family. Every day you eat meals with him. You smile at him. Because if you show one flicker of rage, one moment of grief, you're next. The ancient historian Tacitus wrote that Caligula had remarkable natural ability at concealing his feelings. That's not a compliment. That's a description of a trauma response. Now here's where the story gets weird. When Tiberius finally dies and Caligula becomes emperor at age 24, Rome absolutely loves him. The first 6 months? He is brilliant. He gives amnesty to political prisoners. He publishes the imperial budget, something Romans had never seen before, making government transparent. He holds games and celebrations. The Senate declares him the best emperor since Augustus. Then suddenly he gets sick. Really sick. For weeks he's apparently near death. And when he recovers, everything changes. The ancient sources say he went mad. But here's what they actually describe. A man who suddenly starts performing madness. Testing people. Humiliating the Senate. Doing deliberately outrageous things to see who would stop him. And here's the question nobody asks. What if that was the plan all along? Think about it. Caligula watched his family destroyed by a system. The Roman aristocracy, the Senate, the Praetorian Guard. These weren't good people. These were oligarchs who'd spent decades manipulating emperors, getting rich off corruption, treating common Romans like dirt. When Caligula declares he's going to make his horse a consul, one of the highest offices in Rome, everyone says, see, he's insane. But read what he actually said. He told the Senate, my horse would do a better job than you. That's not insane. That's a burn. That's him saying you're all so useless I could replace you with a literal animal. The stories about Caligula, the incest, the declaring himself a god, the random executions, when you trace them back to the sources, they're almost all from senators writing decades later after they'd killed him. They needed him to be a monster. Because they'd murdered an emperor, his wife, and his infant daughter. But what if Caligula was running an experiment? What if he was asking, how much can an emperor get away with before someone stops him? And what if the answer terrified him? Because here's the thing they don't tell you, Caligula didn't just test the Senate. He tested the Praetorian Guard, his own bodyguards. And in the end he was right too. They were the ones who murdered him. So let's talk about what actually happened in those 4 years. Because the truth? It's somehow darker than the myth. October 37 AD. 6 months into his reign, Caligula collapses. The Roman historian Suetonius says he suffered from a serious illness. Philo of Alexandria, who was actually alive at the time, says the entire empire held its breath. People made vows to the gods, promising to sacrifice their own lives if the emperor recovered. Modern historians have theories: encephalitis, epilepsy, hyperthyroidism. But here's what's fascinating, we know exactly what the symptoms looked like from the ancient accounts. Fever? Yes. But also something else. After he recovered, people said he suffered from insomnia. He would wander the palace at night, calling out to daylight. He reportedly told people he had conversations with the moon goddess. Now, does that sound like madness? Or does that sound like someone who stopped sleeping because every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face? His brothers? Does that sound like someone having flashbacks? The Romans didn't have a word for PTSD. They definitely didn't understand complex trauma. But we do. And here's the chilling part. Ancient sources say that before the illness, Caligula was restrained, measured, almost too controlled. After the illness, it was like he stopped caring about the mask. What if the illness didn't break his mind? What if it broke his fear? Okay, let's talk about the crazy stuff. Because this is what everyone knows about Caligula, right? He declared himself a living god. Except, so did Alexander the Great. So did every pharaoh of Egypt. When Rome conquered Egypt, they inherited that tradition. Augustus, the good emperor, was worshipped as a god in the eastern provinces while he was still alive. The Senate just waited until he died to make it official in Rome. Caligula? He just stopped pretending there was a difference. He built temples to himself, demanded people worship him. But he also, and this is in the sources, would dress up as Venus, as Mercury, as Jupiter. He'd walk around in costumes. That's not a god complex. That's mockery. He's making fun of the whole concept. He's saying, you want to worship power? Fine. Watch me show you how ridiculous you all look. He allegedly had incestuous relationships with his sisters. This one comes from Suetonius, writing 80 years later. But here's the thing, this same charge was leveled against basically every emperor the Senate didn't like. It's the ancient Roman equivalent of a tabloid smear. What we know for certain, Caligula loved his sisters, especially Drusilla. When she died, possibly in the same plague that nearly killed him, he was devastated. He had her deified, declared public mourning. Some historians think the incest rumors came from the fact that he showed them too much public affection by Roman standards. But think about it. His sisters were the only family he had left. The only people who survived the same trauma he did. In a palace full of people who might murder you, wouldn't you cling to the only humans you could trust? The random executions. This one's real. Caligula absolutely had people killed. But let's look at who. Tiberius's former advisors who helped murder Caligula's family. Senators who'd gotten rich off corruption under the previous regime. The Praetorian prefect Macro, who'd helped Caligula take power, then tried to control him. Gemellus, Tiberius's grandson, the rival heir. Are these random executions? Or is this a man systematically eliminating everyone involved in his family's destruction? Everyone who thinks they can control him. Let's talk about Incitatus. The horse. This is probably the most famous Caligula story. He loved his horse so much the story goes that he made it a priest. He was going to make it a consul. He built it a marble stable with a jeweled collar. He invited it to dinner parties. Every historian loves to point at this and say, see? Insane. But let's actually read what the sources say. Suetonius, our main source, says Caligula planned to make the horse a consul, not that he did, he planned to. And Dio Cassius, another historian, tells us what Caligula said when senators objected. At least my horse doesn't plot against me. This isn't about the horse. This was never about the horse. The consulship was the highest office in Rome besides emperor. Senators spent their entire lives, their entire fortunes, competing for it. It was supposed to represent the pinnacle of Roman dignity and achievement. And Caligula's saying, this office you all worship? I'm going to give it to an animal. Because that's what I think of your achievements. That's what I think of your dignity. You're all so corrupt, so useless that my horse, an actual horse, would be an improvement. But here's what's brilliant, he never actually does it. He just threatens to. He keeps senators in constant fear that he might follow through. He's running psychological warfare, showing them that he could destroy everything they value, and there's nothing they can do to stop him. It's not madness. It's performance art. Dark, cruel performance art designed to show the Senate exactly how powerless they are. And the fact that 2,000 years later, we're still talking about the crazy emperor who loved his horse, means his enemies won. They got to write the story. In 39 AD, 2 years into his reign, Caligula does something genuinely insane, by ancient standards. He orders the construction of a temporary bridge across the Bay of Baiae. 3 miles of boats lashed together, covered with earth, so he can ride his horse across the bay. The sources say this cost a fortune. It caused a grain shortage because the boats were needed for shipping. And Caligula does it just to ride across the bay. He wears Alexander the Great's breastplate, allegedly taken from Alexander's tomb, and crosses back and forth. Madness, right? Except a fortune teller had once told the Emperor Tiberius that Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. It was a Roman expression like, when pigs fly. Caligula's bridge was him saying, I did the impossible. I am the impossible. But here's what happens right after the bridge stunt. Caligula discovers a conspiracy. His own brother-in-law, Marcus Lepidus, married to his beloved sister, was plotting with two of his other sisters to overthrow him. The Praetorian Guard was involved. Senators were involved. And this is where you have to ask, did the bridge make him paranoid? Or did he build the bridge because he knew about the conspiracy and wanted one last moment of triumph? The sources say he executed Lepidus. He exiled his sisters, his own sisters, the only family he had left. He allegedly made senators run alongside his chariot for miles as punishment. But think about what just happened. The people closest to him, his family, just tried to murder him. How many times can you survive your family trying to kill you before you become someone else entirely? Here's what the traditional story never tells you. The Senate wasn't a group of noble statesmen suffering under a tyrant. They were an oligarchy that had spent the last 50 years being completely dysfunctional. Under Augustus, they pretended to have power while Augustus made all the decisions. Under Tiberius, they couldn't decide anything without him, but he hated them and left Rome to live on an island. Then comes Caligula, young, inexperienced. They think they can control him like they controlled other emperors. But Caligula won't play the game. He openly mocks them. He makes them vote on ridiculous proposals. He humiliates them in public. And most importantly, he goes over their heads directly to the people of Rome. He holds games. He distributes money. He makes the emperorship popular with regular Romans, not just the elite. And the Senate hates this. Because if the emperor doesn't need them, what are they? So here's the question. When they write about Caligula later after they've killed him, what are they going to say? They can't say, we murdered him because he gave too much power to common people. They can't say, we killed him because he wouldn't let us be corrupt. They can't say, we assassinated him because he humiliated us. So they say he was mad. They say he was a tyrant. They pile on every rumor, every scandal, every half-truth. They make him into a monster. Because that's the only story that justifies what they did. But here's the evidence they couldn't erase. When Caligula died, the common people of Rome rioted. They demanded his assassins be executed. They mourned him. The Senate and the Praetorian Guard? They threw a party. They literally threw a party and started arguing about who would be emperor next. So who was really the tyrant? The young emperor who gave games to the people? Or the oligarchs who murdered him, his wife, and his baby daughter because he wouldn't let them run the empire? January 24, 41 AD. 4 years into Caligula's reign. He's 28 years old. He's at the Palatine Games, theatrical performances in a temporary theater. The sources tell us he's actually in a good mood. He's joking around. Between acts, he goes into a hallway, a covered passage underneath the theater. That's where they get him. The leader is Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian tribune, one of Caligula's own bodyguards. The sources say Caligula had been mocking Chaerea for weeks, calling him effeminate, making him use embarrassing passwords. But Chaerea wasn't acting alone. Multiple Praetorian officers were involved. Senators knew. Some may have been directly involved. They stab Caligula 30 times. When he falls, they keep stabbing. The sources say he tried to call out, tried to fight back, but there were too many of them. Then, and this is the part that reveals everything, they go find his wife, Caesonia. She's with their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla. Caesonia is murdered. Sources say her head was smashed against a wall. The baby, Caligula's only child, an infant girl, is grabbed by a centurion who throws her against a stone wall until she stops crying. This isn't justice. This isn't tyrannicide. This is making sure there are no heirs. This is eliminating the entire bloodline. And then the Praetorian Guard, the same guards who murdered the emperor, they go find Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace. They declare him emperor. The Senate argues for hours about restoring the Republic. But they don't have an army. The Praetorians do. So Claudius becomes emperor. And almost immediately, Claudius starts reversing Caligula's policies, restoring power to the Senate, giving privileges back to the aristocracy. It's almost like, that was the plan all along. So how did we end up with the story we have? The mad emperor who had sex with his sisters and made his horse a consul? Let's look at our sources. Suetonius, writing 80 years after Caligula's death. Under emperors who needed the Senate's approval. His biography is full of people say, and it is reported that, classic rumor language. Dio Cassius, writing 150 years later, relying on sources we can't verify, many of which came from the Senate. Seneca, writing during Caligula's reign, but here's the key, he was exiled by Caligula. He's not exactly an objective source. But here's what's fascinating. When you read these sources carefully, even they can't hide certain facts. Caligula was popular with common Romans. His early reign was successful. His madness conveniently targeted the same aristocrats who later killed him. He died in a coordinated assassination involving the highest levels of government. His entire family was wiped out. Imagine if the only record of a modern leader came from people who staged a coup against them. Would you trust that story? The Roman Senate was the ancient world's ultimate spin machine. They literally got to write history because they survived, they controlled the narrative, and they needed to justify murdering a 28-year-old and his infant daughter. So they made him crazy. They made him evil. They turned him into a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. But what if the real cautionary tale is about what happens when oligarchs feel threatened? When an old guard sees their power slipping away? So here's where we end up. Was Caligula a monster? Yeah, probably. Some of those executions were almost certainly cruel. The psychological torture of the Senate, even if deserved, was still torture. And absolute power, even when used against the corrupt, is still absolute power. But was he insane? Was he a mad tyrant who killed randomly and declared himself a god because his brain broke? Or was he a young man who watched his entire family murdered by the state, who spent his teenage years living with his family's killer, who survived through deception and control, and then, when given power, decided to show the system exactly what it had created? Caligula somehow survived. At 18 years old, he was summoned to the island of Capri by Emperor Tiberius. Now, Tiberius had retired to Capri to live out his final years in, let's call it, seclusion. But Roman historians, Suetonius, Tacitus, Dio Cassius, all describe what was really happening on that island. And it's disturbing. Tiberius had built an elaborate palace filled with what ancient sources called chambers of secret indulgence. Rooms decorated with pornographic art. Young slaves of both genders brought to the island for the emperor's pleasure. Tacitus writes that Tiberius trained children he called little fishes to swim between his legs in the bath and perform acts that were illegal even in permissive Rome. And Caligula, teenage Caligula, the sole survivor of his murdered family, was brought into this environment. Forced to live there. Forced to witness it. Some historians suggest forced to participate. Suetonius records that when people asked Caligula how he survived Tiberius, how he managed to stay in the emperor's good graces while watching his family die, Caligula would only say, "I became the perfect guest." The truth is probably somewhere in between. Trauma doesn't excuse cruelty, but it does explain it. And Caligula was definitely traumatized. But here's what we know for certain. The people who killed him weren't heroes. They were conspirators who murdered an emperor, his wife, and his baby daughter to protect their own power. And then they spent the next 2,000 years convincing us that he deserved it. Maybe the real story of Caligula isn't about one man's descent into madness. Maybe it's about what happens when you give absolute power to someone who's lost everything, who trusts no one, who's learned that everyone who says they love you might be planning your death. Maybe it's about how the winners write history. And how, sometimes, the monster in the story isn't the person everyone says it is. Caligula ruled for 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. He was murdered at 28 years old. His entire family was dead by the time he was 25. And we remember him as the crazy emperor who loved his horse. Maybe that was the point. Maybe making him crazy was easier than admitting what Rome did to him. What Rome did to his family. What the aristocracy does to anyone who threatens their power. 2,000 years later, we're still arguing about whether Caligula was mad or whether he was the only sane person in a completely broken system. And honestly, that might be the most Roman thing about his story. The Senate got what they wanted. They got rid of the emperor who wouldn't play their game. But Caligula? He made sure we're still talking about him 2,000 years later. In the end, maybe he won after all. If this changed how you see Roman history, or history in general, hit that subscribe button. We've got more videos breaking down the stories everyone thinks they know but actually don't. And let me know in the comments, monster or victim? Was Caligula insane or was Rome? See you in the next one.